Morning settled over the hillside without distinction. Low cloud pressed against the tree-line, flattening the distance between roof and sky. Moisture remained on the grass where night air had cooled more quickly than the ground beneath it. A narrow road curved upward toward a cluster of buildings whose windows reflected only a dull, colorless light. No movement showed behind the glass. The place appeared neither abandoned nor inhabited, only paused, as if waiting for instruction that had not yet arrived. Near the entrance gate, a wooden post leaned slightly inward where the soil had softened. Boot marks from the previous day remained visible in the mud, their edges already beginning to blur. Someone had closed the gate carefully, though not fully. The latch rested against metal without catching. Nothing suggested urgency, only continuation. Inside one of the larger houses, air carried the faint smell of damp plaster and extinguished coal. Furniture stood arranged with a formality that no longer served a purpose. Curtains hung straight despite the draft that entered through an unsealed frame. On a table near the wall lay several papers weighted by a small stone. Documents left in place because removing them would require decision. Dust had begun to gather in the folds of the fabric chairs, settling evenly, without preference. In the months after Germany's collapse, properties once associated with political authority entered a different kind of silence. Military defeat had arrived suddenly in movement and noise, yet what followed unfolded through procedure. Lists were written, ownership questioned, keys collected, labeled, stored. Buildings did not disappear. They waited to be classified. Some houses stood in mountain regions where travel remained slow even in ordinary years. Others lay near towns still clearing debris from damaged streets. Their locations mattered less than the administrative question they presented. Who controlled them now, and for what purpose? Officials arriving to inspect such places often carried folders thicker than necessary, as if weight might compensate for uncertainty. They walked through rooms methodically, noting dimensions, condition, furnishings. Conversation remained brief, limited to measurements and signatures. At the Alpine residence once used for seasonal retreat, weather shaped the pace of inspection. Roads washed out by spring thaw delayed transport. Windows left closed through winter opened reluctantly, hinges stiff with cold. Inside, the scale of the rooms contrasted with the reduced circumstances beyond the mountains. Villages below faced shortages of fuel and bread, while the empty structure above contained unused space measured in quiet square meters. Soldiers assigned to guard the site treated the duty as routine. They rotated shifts, checked doors, recorded nothing unusual. Some had fought weeks earlier in terrain not unlike this one. Now they stood watch over furniture and stone. Their posture suggested patience rather than vigilance. War had ended unevenly. Stillness required adjustment. Questions about the future of such properties rarely produced immediate answers. Allied authorities disagreed at times over classification, state asset, personal holding, symbolic location, potential evidence. Legal language expanded to accommodate situations not fully anticipated. Translators searched for precise equivalence between systems of law that had developed separately. Meanwhile, buildings remained unchanged, their physical condition indifferent to debate. In urban districts, smaller apartments connected to former officials faced quicker transformation. Families displaced by bombing required shelter. Municipal offices reassigned rooms without ceremony. Wallpaper peeled where repairs had been rushed. Names once associated with authority disappeared from doorways, replaced by handwritten notices indicating new occupants. The shift occurred not through dramatic gesture but through necessity measured in available space. Certain locations carried heavier symbolic weight and therefore moved more slowly through administrative channels. Decisions about preservation, destruction, or repurposing depended on political judgment as much as practical need. Some argued that removal would prevent future reverence. Others believed controlled use might better dissolve meaning over time. Committees formed, reported, dissolved, then reformed under revised authority. During these intervals, dust continued to settle in undisturbed rooms. Local residents sometimes passed such properties on daily errands. Their attention rarely lingered. Immediate concerns, food distribution, employment registration, transport permits, occupied thought more fully than abandoned houses on distant slopes. Memory did not vanish, yet survival required narrower focus. The buildings remained visible without being central. In one provincial office, an administrator reviewed property inventories compiled from scattered records. Ink had faded on several pages. Dates overlapped without clear sequence. He compared signatures, corrected spellings, attached supplemental notes. The work demanded accuracy without offering conclusion. When finished for the day, he closed the folder carefully, aligning edges with the desk. Outside, carts moved slowly along a street still uneven from shell impact. Paperwork advanced at a different pace. Legal ownership presented particular difficulty. Personal property associated with a deceased individual intersected with state confiscation policies and broader denazification measures. Courts required documentation that war had disrupted or destroyed. Witnesses recalled fragments rather than full sequences. Testimony varied in detail yet remained consistent in uncertainty. Judgments, when issued, reflected available evidence more than complete understanding. Some structures were eventually transferred to government agencies for administrative use. Offices replaced. Private rooms. Filing cabinets occupied spaces once arranged for reception. Heating systems functioned irregularly, requiring maintenance crews unfamiliar with original design. Over time, routine activity altered perception. A building used daily for paperwork lost part of its earlier association, though not entirely. Other sites were dismantled deliberately. Materials salvaged where possible entered reconstruction projects elsewhere. Stones removed from one foundation supported another. Timber beams carried new roofs above families unconnected to former ownership. Physical continuity persisted even as symbolic meaning shifted. The process attracted limited attention. Rebuilding occurred across the country in similar fashion. In mountain regions, harsher weather accelerated decay where maintenance lapsed. Roof tiles loosened under repeated freeze and thaw. Water entered through small openings, widening them gradually. Interiors darkened as mold spread along walls left unheeded. Nature required no directive to proceed. Years performed their own quiet revisions. Tourists did not arrive immediately. Travel restrictions and economic hardship limited movement. Only later, as stability returned, did curiosity reappear in modest form. Visitors asked for directions, paused briefly, then departed. Local authorities responded with practical measures. Signage, restricted access, occasional guided oversight, intended less to encourage attention than to manage it. Interest remained controlled, subdued. Historians approaching these locations in subsequent decades found environments already altered by time and policy. Original furnishings had disappeared or been redistributed. Architectural outlines remained, yet context required reconstruction through documents rather than observation alone. Interpretation proceeded cautiously, aware that physical space could suggest clarity unsupported by evidence. Public memory shifted alongside generational change. For those who had lived through the final months of war, such properties carried immediate association. Younger citizens encountered them through education or passing reference. Emotional intensity diminished, replaced by analytical distance. Buildings became case studies in governance, symbolism, and post-war reconstruction rather than personal reminders. Archival records revealed administrative language notably restrained. Reports described square footage, repair costs, jurisdictional authority. Rarely did they speculate on meaning. Bureaucracy favored measurable detail over reflection. This restraint shaped later understanding, leaving historians to interpret silence as carefully as statement. Occasional debate resurfaced regarding preservation. Some argued that removal erased tangible evidence of dictatorship. Others feared that visibility might invite misinterpretation or fascination detached from historical responsibility. Compromise often resulted in partial conservation combined with contextual explanation. Even then, visitor numbers remained modest compared with more prominent historical sites. Weather continued its slow influence across decades. Snow accumulated, melted, returned. Vegetation reclaimed neglected edges of property lines. Paths once maintained regularly narrowed beneath grass. The landscape adjusted without reference to human history, though traces persisted for those who looked closely. In administrative terms, the fate of these real estate holdings resolved gradually through ordinary governance. Ownership transferred to state control, municipal authority, or private use depending on circumstance. Legal disputes diminished as documentation stabilized. What had once seemed exceptional entered routine classification within property law. Yet routine did not eliminate complexity. Each building embodied overlapping histories: domestic life, political power, wartime collapse, post-war adaptation. None of these layers fully replaced another. Instead, they accumulated quietly, like dust settling in successive seasons. Visitors standing in such places decades later often encountered an absence of spectacle. Rooms appeared smaller than expected. Views from windows showed ordinary terrain. Trees, roads, distant houses indistinguishable from countless others. The physical environment resisted dramatic interpretation. Meaning depended largely on prior knowledge carried into the space. For nearby communities, integration proved practical rather than philosophical. Roads required maintenance regardless of history. Utilities followed existing routes. Children attended schools built where land permitted construction. Daily life absorbed geography without constant reference to earlier ownership. Memory persisted unevenly, strongest among those with direct recollection. By the late 20th century, many former properties associated with the regime had either disappeared or blended into surrounding development. Documentation remained in archives accessible primarily to researchers. Public awareness narrowed to a few widely discussed locations, leaving others largely unremarked. Silence deepened not through concealment but through dispersal of attention. Still, the administrative processes that determined their fate offered insight into the broader transition from dictatorship to Reconstruction. Decisions emphasized legality, procedure, and measured responsibility rather than symbolic gesture alone. Governance reasserted itself through paperwork, inspection, and incremental policy. Methods quieter than war yet more enduring. Even now, in regions where foundations once supported guarded residences, traces survive in altered form. A change in tree alignment. Stonework incorporated into later construction. Subtle irregularities in land use visible only from certain angles. Nothing announces significance directly. Recognition depends on patient observation. Evening returns much as morning once arrived, without distinction. Cloud settles low against the hills. Windows reflect dim light from within ordinary rooms. Roads carry occasional vehicles whose destinations hold no connection to earlier authority. The landscape continues, shaped more by weather and routine than by memory. What became of Hitler's real estate after the war did not resolve in a single act of removal or preservation. Instead, it entered the same slow current that carried much of post-war Europe forward: documentation, reassignment, decay, rebuilding. Physical structures yielded gradually to time and governance, leaving behind records more durable than stone. In quiet places where foundations remain buried beneath newer ground, history persists without display, not concluded, not entirely visible, only present in the measured distance between what once stood and what now continues.